Hello and welcome back to Dystopia Now. I'm Kate Willett.
I'm Emil Torres.
Today we're really excited. We have one of our first repeat guests on the show. I'm stoked. Are you stoked, Emil?
Very much so, yes.
so back when we first started the show, Jacob was one of our maybe third or fourth guests or something, and was working on the book that we're going to talk about today, Gilded Rage, which in my opinion, I think is one of the best kind of overviews, but it's also very in detail about how the tech industry moved so far right. Or I don't even know if Jacob would, characterize that as moving. I don't know. That would be one of the interesting things to talk about on this show. But welcome to the show, Jacob Silverman.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate the kind words. I really did try to write the book as a bit of a handbook and explainer of how we got to this moment.
It's such a fascinating book. It is very depressing, but it's
I've heard that a lot too.
I mean, it is. I think it's a great overview. It includes a lot of things that we've talked about on this show, but it also includes a lot of things that we haven't talked about on this show before. So I thought that would kind of be an interesting place to start, because I think that there are some great points that you bring up about the material explanations for why these people are who they are politically. And I think a lot of what we talk about on this show tends to be, more about like their weird ideologies. I mean, yeah, that's the point of the show, is to talk about their weird ideologies. But I was particularly interested in your thesis that zero interest rate policy, years of it, and taking it away is responsible for so much of these guys' worldview and their current actions. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure, and I certainly try to get into some of the psychology and the ideology of these guys and who they are, and their reactionary social beliefs and anti-woke politics as they develop them. But I do think the zero interest rate policy, or ZIRP as it was often called, is really important. That was when, after the 2008 financial crisis, interest rates essentially went to zero. And for more than a decade, it was really easy to borrow money. This was, a good thing for a lot of people trying to get a mortgage. It was a very good thing for people in the corporate elite or people in Silicon Valley, anyone borrowing lots and lots of money, or institutions who are hoping to borrow millions or billions of dollars and not necessarily have to pay it back right away. And I think that contributed to the speculative fervor that happened broadly during, the later Obama and early Trump eras. And this is also the crypto era. This is when the tech industry was starting to make these really big bets that have only increased with AI, but that didn't necessarily have a clear payoff at the end. And the other feature that we saw when they were borrowing all this money is that people were getting richer than ever. I mean, someone like Jeff Bezos in the second Obama administration to start was, I think, worth maybe $23 billion in 2012. Now he's worth more than 10 times that. And
Wow.
We saw the growth of these fortunes that we hadn't really seen before, and that we almost take for granted now, I think, in some ways. But, we didn't have nearly as many billionaires before, and we certainly didn't have people worth hundreds of billions of dollars. And, those policies started to change, especially under Biden, when interest rates started inching up. I mean, this is the Federal Reserve mostly deciding this. This is supposedly an independent agency that, Trump is trying to assert control of over now. But the fact that those interest rates started increasing, and I would argue that these guys started having to make smarter bets, started to have to build real businesses, they did not take that very well. And
Yeah.
they sort of that became kind of, I think, almost, actually, to go back to the psychological aspect, this is something that nagged at them, that made them angry, that contributed to the idea that the Biden administration and Democrats were a little bit of an adversary for them. But I also think it meant that the end of that easy money, to refer to another book title of mine, made it a little hard for them to feel like they, even as wealthy as they were, that they were on top of the world, because a lot of that money was no longer so readily available.
I guess, one thing I liked about your book is I feel like we often get this sort of simplistic explanation of like, yeah, Elon Musk was red-pilled on Twitter, or it's because, he's like this because he has a trans daughter. But I think your book was really good at pointing out the financial and material incentives that have caused these folks to move right. And you talk about a few of them. I was wondering if you could just give us like a really broad, top level overview of like, okay, what are the main reasons?
Less than 30 minutes.
Yeah.
Sure. Well, I think the end of zero interest rates, as we just talked about. I think seeing the government as more of an adversary. But I also think broadly the phrase I've been using lately is that these people don't want to be governed, and so it was both some changes in the culture and in governance and in the tech industry's relation to the regulatory state, perhaps. But really, also, this is where we see them moving to the right, becoming more like Peter Thiel or some of the other kind of lodestars of right-wing conservatism in the tech industry, that they didn't want to submit to any regulation. I mean, another policy change that didn't even happen was the Biden administration talking about taxing unrealized capital gains. And this, for Mark Andreessen, who I think is a pivotal figure in what we're talking about, and someone who really did become pretty reactionary over the last few years, this was a big problem for him. He said it on his podcast, I believe summer of 2024, when he kind of came out for Trump. He said that the proposed tax on unrealized capital gains, basically like investments in startups and things like that, any stock that had matured a whole lot but they hadn't sold yet, was a red line for him. And to me, that seems a little ridiculous. That's not going to destroy the foundations of their wealth or Silicon Valley wealth or innovation, but it showed the degree in which any encroachment upon their autonomy and upon their wealth and power was considered intolerable now. And to that, I would add when the woke mind, what the woke mind virus is actually about, which is these changes in the culture that people could not tolerate. I'm talking about the tech CEOs could not tolerate, like BLM, Me Too, more recently. Rank and file tech employees not happy that their employers are doing work for the Israeli government, and then finally with Musk, I think you actually said it. I mean, his daughter coming out as trans and saying that she didn't want to be associated with him, that he bullied her. He has said in an interview with Jordan Peterson, and I believe elsewhere, that that's where the woke mind virus essentially came from, the idea for him. He said, he's dead named his child and said the woke mind virus killed my son. So that's a quick overview, I'd say, of a lot of the economic and those social and political conditions. And Musk isn't the only one who talks about his kids this way. I mean, someone who's sort of more tech adjacent, but like Bill Ackman has complained that Harvard turned his daughter into a Marxist because she wrote her thesis on communism, I believe. There is a way in which they don't understand the next generation, whether it's their children or the younger rank and file at these tech companies who are starting to protest or to organize. And they're not a monolith, but and I think that aspect can't be ignored also.
It's worth adding, I think that there's a further connection between wokeness and this aversion to being governed, right? Because wokeness has an impact in the actual workspace, right? Within companies, sexism, the trend of people putting their pronouns at the end of emails and so on. All of these are like impositions from outside. That, as far as I could tell, is yet another reason why the people in tech, in particular the tech leaders, opposed wokeness, because they felt like they were being forced to do something. Suddenly, like you can't say the R word. You can't like sexually harass women, and that's sort of an impingement upon what they feel is their entitlement. Right? I mean, does that make sense? Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. Yeah. And there's something that maybe I don't go into in the book as much, but like this sort of anti-HR attitude, and like that HR is very woman-coded. You may remember there's this meme that's gone around before, especially on like Manosphere or the Muskian corners of X, where like there were some women dancing, I think, but
I knew the exact one.
Yeah,
they were
they're an Australian. Yes.
Yeah.
And so many people took this to be like the sort of like progressive female HR type that they hated, that's somehow ruining their lives with DEI and various workplace rules. And yeah, I'm glad you remember that one, because like it became very popular on the right, but it also was totally misleading. I mean, obviously it doesn't reflect reality. It's some Australian people. It's just a dance, whatever. But that is you're right. That is the very misogynist picture they've put together. I mean, this is a pretty misogynist culture we're talking about. And that any rules, especially those seemingly put towards them by women or people who aren't white men generally, are pretty intolerable and all start to be personally offensive and contribute to the sense of victimization and that their freedom is somehow impinged upon. Where, I think what you're getting at also is like, if you step back, like these are some of the freest, most powerful, most wealthy people in the world, including like the rank and file followers of Elon Musk, the people who also, the Twitter accounts who complain about this stuff to him. So I think that's a very good point.
I wanted to share something personal, which is that I have the woke mind virus. It's I don't know how long I have, but
it can recur.
Yeah.
Are you quarantining?
It flares up. I'm in the middle of a flare up of the woke mind virus. Some would call it woke 2.0, but it's very sad. Cultural Marxist as well. But this seems as good a time as any to discuss something that's happened since you wrote the book, which is that a lot of these tech leaders, in addition to wanting a more perverted HR-free workplace, also were associated with a pedophile, Jeffrey Epstein. Like a lot of these guys are in the Epstein files. I mean, Bill Gates, oh my God, some of that shit that came out. What's your reaction to all this?
I mean, I think it's important. I always try to step beyond the initial reaction that some folks have in our hyper cynical age, where it's like, "Oh, are you surprised?" or whatever.
Yeah, of course.
Like, it's of course important to know the details, and we knew some of this. We kind of knew that Epstein might have been blackmailing Gates in some sense, but one thing in particular I think is interesting. Not just the breadth of his connections. I mean, he was involved with so many top tech figures, and in what capacity is certainly worth asking. But whether it was facilitating illicit sex, whether it was blackmail, whatever it might be. But also, I think his relationship with Peter Thiel is pretty revealing and important. We knew that they communicated, but this seems to go a lot deeper than we knew before, and Thiel is obviously a pretty sinister figure. But what particularly struck me about that were two things. One, the money. Epstein had invested tens of millions of dollars, I believe, in Valar, which is one of Thiel's Lord of the Ring named investment funds. So that's a fair amount of money. That's pretty notable.
Yeah.
And he had made a pretty big profit, an unrealized profit that he never got to reap, of course. And then there's a comment, I think, from Epstein to Thiel in an email exchange where he basically says, "The world falling apart is good for us." I forget the exact quote, but people can find this out there about like how things falling apart. I think it was in relation to Brexit. Things falling apart is good for them because then they basically pick up assets on the cheap. And that is just so revealing of not only the Epstein worldview, but in some ways the tech fascist worldview, which is that this effort to destroy liberal institutions, whatever you might think of them in their existing kind of crappy state, is very intentional, and like they want a more broken world. And I think that certainly applies to the more radical elements of the tech industry, but also kind of by default, or the way they act in the world increasingly describes the rest of it too. So I'm interested in particular relationships like with the Google founders and others, and with Epstein, the Google founders who found an interest in buying private islands after they met Epstein. Things like that I think are important. But the money, the politics, the potential for blackmail and espionage, and and how that plays out geopolitically, I think is very important too. So, I think there's certainly more. And the only thing I would say is, the tech industry in its own fashion has been good at avoiding accountability. And certainly during something like Me Too, we saw it didn't really penetrate the industry, produce a strong kind of antibody or reaction. We saw people like Andy Rubin from who helped invent Android be paid tens of millions of dollars to go away. And so I hope that there isn't kind of a repeat here with Epstein and the tech industry. Like, there has to be more, more accountability, more digging, some kind of call for something. Like we see in England and elsewhere, people losing their jobs. But I think that the industry is going to try to withstand this in some way, perhaps because the rot is so deep.
With respect to the world being broken and how they benefit from that, I mean, to what extent do you think they are sort of trying to walk a tightrope? Because a fully broken world is not good for them, right? I mean, there are studies, they're contentious. This is an ongoing area of research, but studies showing that historically speaking, one of the harbingers of societal collapse has been radical wealth disparity, right? And so um, these some of these people have to be aware of that. That they're sure, like maybe pushing society in a certain direction of increasing instability is good for them, but they risk crossing a threshold beyond which they lose everything. There was a book that was published just recently, I think late last year, called Goliath's Curse, by a scholar named Lou Kemp. And he points out that if you look at the historical record of civilizational collapse, it's oftentimes the 99% who benefit from civilizational collapse because it's sort of a hard reboot. I know there are other scholars who have said, the only way to get rid of extreme wealth disparities, at least at some point, is for the society to collapse. So I wonder to what extent, a lot of them are talk about like existential risks and these sort of global catastrophic scenarios. Do they not understand that it benefits them in the longer run if there is a foundation of societal stability?
Yeah, that's such a good point and problem to bring up. It's like, do they understand this? And if they do, are they just willing to sprint past, that line and kind of are those guardrails? Like, in some sense, if you want a capitalist society, like you got to make it safe for capitalism. Otherwise, eventually the elites might get their heads chopped off, or everything might crumble in a way that certainly doesn't help them. And I think that's what's scary also about these guys is that they may know that and be willing to keep pushing farther. I mean, there's that line I think from not Douglas Copeland. I'm blanking on the guy's name. But there's a tech critic who
Douglas Rushkoff.
Thank you, Rushkoff. I was thinking of Copeland, the Gen X writer, because someone mentioned him to me recently. Yeah, Douglas Rushkoff has talked about. I think he was hanging out with some billionaires and sort of interviewing them, and they this is in one of his books. They were talking about, once they get flown to their mountain redoubts in New Zealand or wherever to survive the apocalypse, do they have to kill the pilot? That kind of thing. It's like you're right, they are thinking about existential risk in the end of the world and entertaining some really bizarre or outre or terrifying authoritarian ideas about what they might do when that time comes. And that I think is, per the title of my book, maybe what distinguishes them from an earlier generation of ultra-rich, or from like the Gilded Age ultra-rich, where some pretty savage people and probably perpetuated some horrible crimes, but I think in some sense knew where to draw a line, or perhaps maybe we need to build a few hospitals and universities, that kind of thing. And there was also, then we had the antitrust movement of Theodore Roosevelt, and, there were some checks from the outside society. We had the invention of income tax, things to actually keep these people in check, perhaps. So I think what's different now is that, they may not care, even if they do recognize that, you have to make the world sort of safe for or society safe for your worldview. Otherwise, everything falls apart. And the other factor there is that, the ruling order, at least in the government and certainly among Republicans, kind of seems to agree with them. Is not trying to preserve a social safety net or make a more equitable society, and seems to be willing to, keep pushing inequality and making people more desperate.
I suspect some listeners, particularly people who have listened to many episodes, this idea popped into their mind when I asked that question. One feature that makes current billionaires, the current overlords, different than those in the past, is that there are perceived or anticipated escape hatches, which didn't exist before, namely space colonization. Maybe this is another thing that Douglas Rushkoff discusses in his book *Survival of the Richest*. The possibility of digitizing their minds, right? So there are various. So perhaps
I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. It's so stupid because there's just no way it's going to work out at all. Like, so anyway,
this gets at the underlying ideologies, right? Like transhumanism and long-termism, etc. So maybe like people like Peter Thiel are thinking, okay, we're pushing society towards greater instability, and maybe we will cross a kind of Rubicon beyond which like things start to collapse. But that's okay because in this sort of worst case scenario, I still have my apocalyptic bunkers to go to ride it out. Maybe we'll have like super intelligence by then, in which case, like, we'll just task it with, uploading our minds, sending us off to Mars and then beyond to another solar system, etc. And so it's does that make sense? So like there are these sci-fi
Yeah.
fantasies that perhaps can be used by them to justify in their minds the fact that they are flirting with a kind of catastrophic apocalyptic collapse scenario.
Yeah, and I think that also shows. I mean, you're laughing, Kate, but I think that shows how unserious they are in a way, or juvenile.
Yeah,
Like they're
100%.
still living off the sci-fi dreams of their childhood, which are not allegories or things to be learned from or critiqued. They are blueprints to them,
Yeah.
and it's ridiculous. Even though, like, Adam Becker had that great book about how none of this stuff is going to work, including especially going to Mars.
Yeah.
And Peter Thiel, I think last year, or the year before, had an interview. Maybe it was the Douthat interview, but not the one. I mean, not the part where he talks about the Antichrist, but kind of a lesser noted part of some interview was he was talking about talking to Musk and a few years ago, within the last few years, and Musk was talking about going to Mars, and Thiel said something like, well, what if like the woke AI follows you to Mars? And he claimed that Musk looked like shocked and was reassessing his idea of could he get to Mars and escape the woke AI? I mean, this is like, it would be an insult to call this like stone dorm room talk.
Yeah.
It is a little ridiculous, of course, and what makes it terrifying is that they have the resources to try to do this,
Yeah.
and to ruin everything along the way. But yeah, I think you're right that that's the imaginative world that a lot of them do live in, especially because they've spent decades honing it. They've only gotten richer. They've only surrounded themselves with more like yes men and fewer dissenting voices that, who's going to really say no? Who's going to draw a line? And, I do also relate to this, think about like, for example, in the Wall Street Journal, when they've done reporting on Musk's drug use, and which seems pretty well sourced, and I think it's notable he's never sued them over it. There was some reporting that Larry Ellison, and he likes to sue for a lot of different things. One thing I've noted before is I don't think Musk has sued anyone over his reports of his drug use. I don't think he's sued anyone for calling him or Tesla a fraud, which like lots of people have done, including Dustin Moskovitz and some other prominent tech people. But anyway, in that article, there's a line from Larry Ellison, who is his own ghoulish figure, but he apparently told Musk sometime in the last few years, why don't you put down the drugs and come to Lanai, because he owns the entire island, to dry out. And Musk turned him down, probably said he was too busy or something. But there's really no one, Larry Ellison, who's like as spooked up a powerful figure you can be, and is sort of a mentor to Musk, tried to kind of rein him in just on this one aspect of his life, and Musk said no thanks. Like there's no one who could really stop these guys at a certain level from pursuing the things you're talking about and from passing those Rubicons.
Yeah. Maybe Musk said he can't go to Ellison's island because he's busy going to another island.
Yeah.
That's right.
For
yeah.
a wild party.
Well,
a relaxing time is the opposite of what I'm looking for.
I think they talked about this on True and On, but did you see the exchange between Epstein and Musk about about the UN week?
No.
Just for listeners who might not have seen that one, but there's one where Musk says, "What's going to be the wildest party on your island?"
I saw that one. Yeah.
Yeah, there's another one where Epstein says, you should come for UN week. We're going to have a party. There are going to be some very interesting people in town. And Musk, totally oblivious, responds like, dude, I am running the most important companies. We're about to have a rocket test. I cannot waste my time to talk to a bunch of diplomats. And I mean, these are, we can laugh a little bit, but these are obviously horrible people. But Epstein responds, do you think I'm retarded? There won't be anyone over 25 there. Just come.
Yeah.
Oh, God.
Epstein's trying to tell him, like, look, I'm having a party to like blackmail the diplomats or whatever.
Yeah.
And he's like, women, girls, and Musk is so oblivious and so egotistical that he just doesn't, it has to be spelled out for him.
I mean, I think a darker explanation for their arrogance that you do talk a lot about in the book is the fact that these guys, many of them, are manufacturing surveillance and weapons. They have, they have and are planning on having even more violence at their disposal, ability to, surveil everyone from people who are living in Gaza to us right here in the United States. How do you think that affects their decision making and psychology?
Yeah, that's important. That speaks to the new authoritarianism that has consumed these guys, and it also speaks to how they view the world and how they're going to make money. So one of the big shifts in the last decade or two is this embrace of government contracting, which Microsoft is always providing computing services for the government, but now they're all like, yeah, now Microsoft is making goggles for the army, AR goggles that on a multi-billion-dollar contract. Now there are companies being spun up that are purpose-built to be part of this security state, like Anduril or Palantir. And there's no longer any sort of shame or questioning about working for the national security state. In fact, if you do question it, you might very well get fired, as people who protested at Google against the found out. There were 40 or 50 people a couple years ago who did a silent protest against the company's work for the Israeli government, and they were all fired immediately. And so what they've found is that, look, the government has a lot of money to dole out, and the pie is only going to get bigger, probably, especially in the military and defense and intelligence area. And this is going to be a huge fire hose of cash and data and support for them, and something that's certainly been proven so far by the Trump administration and the kind of patronage model of governance that Trump runs, and especially with AI and like these companies that can get involved in Stargate and the other government AI initiatives and get some of these contracts. So, it's both a political shift and the fact that they've dispensed with any qualms about doing military-related work or doing work for illiberal governments or authoritarian ones. And also this personal attitude where they're just sort of like, F you, I'm going to get mine. Or where they're just, they're like Palmer Luckey, the head of Anduril, who's just very jingoistic, nationalistic. The CIA is cool. Let's help them. America is great and worth defending. I've been reading. I just started reading Alex Karp's book because I'm going to write something about Palantir, and it's all about defending the West. This is another concept we hear a lot that you didn't hear in tech 10 years ago. It's driven partly by money, but the money comes together very naturally with this evolving worldview where they don't want to feel sorry for being American or for the horrible crimes and mistakes of the war on terror. They want to, build better drones and start launching them now in Ukraine and Gaza.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I think, one interesting point that you made in the book about, let me rephrase that question. Give me a second. Okay, so one thing that you talked a lot about in the book and in your other book is cryptocurrency, and the relationship that the Trump administration has with cryptocurrency, these guys' evolving relationship with cryptocurrency. And, crypto is funny and it's a scam, but, it's also really influencing what they think and do politically. How do you see that?
Yeah, I used to write about crypto and its use in fraud and various types of crime and illicit finance. And, I really think crypto has evolved its final use case in the form of political corruption. And that's what the Trump administration has demonstrated so well. And I think some of the media is catching up to this. There's good reporting in the Times and the Wall Street Journal especially, actually. But crypto has never really proven itself as kind of a consumer commodity or any of its proclaimed uses for the wider public. But what we've really seen in recent years is its continued uses in organized crime and now political corruption. And Trump famously changed his attitude about Bitcoin, which he had once called a scam. He thought it competed with the US dollar. He didn't like that, which was actually a reasonable opinion. And then his sons and people in the crypto industry changed his mind in 2024. And I write in the book, and just reminding folks, Trump spoke at the big annual Bitcoin conference in 2024. It was in August, I believe, in Nashville. And that was a huge event for his followers. I mean, that was just another stop on the campaign trail, but that really activated the crypto base who are, already leaned right or libertarian and are single issue voters. But I think that was a huge kind of coming together moment. It showed also that Trump could adopt the worldview of some of his closest donors, which is not a surprise, obviously, but he really became fully in line with them. And that's when the crypto industry kind of took over funding the election, really. And Musk was part of this too, but you had Fair Shake, which is the main crypto pack, putting forth more than $100 million. Crypto
That's a
became
lot
the
of like Andreessen, right? Andreessen's money.
Andreessen Horowitz money, Coinbase, some of the crypto trading firms, like there's this one called Jump Trading that most people don't hear about, but it's sort of like the Jane Street of crypto trading. This is when it was really in those last few months of the election cycle that crypto became the largest donor by industry to the election. And this is also, we should remember, an industry that doesn't produce a lot of value. Yes, we hear about it, has a big
Zero
pop cultural,
value.
Yeah, it has a big pop cultural footprint, and a lot of celebrities endorsed it a few years ago. But they're not churning out physical commodities or cash flows or anything that actually is, making money or supporting business. At least not in the honest or legal sense. And that's one way in which sort of their political influence is totally out of whack with actually their kind of economic productivity. And what Trump ultimately found is one, you can make a lot of money doing this by just creating your own cryptocurrencies like Trump Coin, which he released inauguration weekend. And then what cryptos ultimately provide, I know it's crazy just to even think about that one thing.
Yeah.
That was just one thing.
Yeah. And then Melania coin too.
Yeah, the same thing.
Yeah.
And then what it ultimately has become, and this has been pretty well chronicled too, but it is the payment rail to bribe the president or to gain favor with the first family. And whether you're a UAE prince who wants to get some NVIDIA chips that you have limited access to, which is the big story that's been chronicled in the Times and the Wall Street Journal, or I've written about a Russian fraudster who has invested at least 25 million, it might be actually 50 or more, in World Liberty Financial. I've written about a very murky Chinese financier who no one knows what his deal is, who has sent at least $100 million to World Liberty Financial. I mean, there are just all kinds of people who are putting money in Trump's pocket. And and that's what crypto has become. That's what the crypto industry is complicit in, I would say. And that's also what we're seeing now in kind of the larger political landscape. I mean, we had the Genius Act pass, which legitimized stable coins, and Trump is in the stablecoin business. And what it's really made it so is that the industry has more access to mainstream finance, and it's also made it so that we all have to play by crypto's rules. And now crypto is insinuating itself more into the financial system. There are these kind of esoteric funds and financial products built on top of crypto. And so it means that, like, if you're lucky enough to have a retirement account these days, which not all of us have one, it might be exposed to crypto in some sort or another. It might not own crypto directly, but might be invested in a company that has a lot of crypto on its balance sheet, or in one of these crypto ETF funds. And so it's just this kind of instability and weakness that gets, and corruption that gets percolated through the financial system. And we really have Trump and his crypto backers to thank for that. I think if we had a Democratic president, there would be a lot of issues, but I think we would see crypto being a much smaller portion of the financial system, as it really should be. I mean, it should be considered a predatory financial product, or like tightly regulated in its little corner like gambling is. Or used to be.
Yeah, I was like, oh, that's changing too. I mean,
I was gonna say used to be. I mean, with Polymarket and Kalshi and with sports betting, like everything is becoming gambling now. But so that's another explanation for sort of the rise and fall and rise again of crypto. But I think ultimately it wouldn't be where it is right now if not for finding this ultimate utility, which is as a tool of political corruption, and for getting the president involved in the biggest financial scam in presidential history.
It's mind blowing. It's mind blowing how much of the economy is AI and gambling at this point.
Yeah, it's all fake.
So one thing that I wanted to talk about on this show was, I think, I noticed that there's a little bit of a difference in the way that you two, as the two people I'm talking to on this show, sort of attribute what's going on with what the fuck is going on with these guys, I guess is the eloquent way I'm going to say that right now. Emil, I know, puts enormous emphasis on transhumanism, and it's not something that you, Jacob, talk about a lot. And I was curious about, some of the things that you didn't talk about in the book, like, or didn't talk about very much, at least, transhumanism, effective altruism, like how much do you see these things, influencing these folks? And why was it something that you didn't feel like was a big focus in how I guess a lot of these people became, I'll use the word fascist.
And may I add
Sure.
something real fast, if you don't mind, Jacob?
Yeah.
Just that my excuse for a strong emphasis on the underlying ideologies that have shaped worldviews within Silicon Valley, and in particular, given rise to the ongoing race to build artificial general intelligence or some kind of godlike super being, is really, it has to do with my background. I don't know that much about economics. I don't know that much about cryptocurrency, and so on. And so I do think that a legit criticism of my approach is that there is a lacuna, there's deficiency, in that it's not a complete picture. And I've never claimed it is a complete, like an exhaustive analysis of what's going on. I do think that the ideologies like transhumanism and effective altruism, long-termism, accelerationism, et cetera, these are all in one way or another like fundamentally utopian ideologies. And I think that they have played an integral role in like I said before, launching and sustaining for a time the AGI race. Although I think pecuniary interests have become very dominant over, particularly since ChatGPT was released in 2022. Um, One thing I would like to see, and I'm sort of talking to myself here, is a more comprehensive analysis. 'Cause I feel like that's missing. One that integrates an emphasis on these ideologies, which I would trace back to, one could argue that transhumanism is in some way an outgrowth of capitalism. I'm very sympathetic with that view, but I personally would also trace another lineage of the genealogy of transhumanism and the whole TESCREAL bundle really to Christianity, right? And to Christian eschatology, the promise of paradise. I mean, the whole like eschatological narrative of transhumanism, it's very similar to Christianity. There's resurrection, there's eternal life in heaven forever, in the literal heavens forever, and so on. But there is this other lineage that goes back to capitalism, and it's sort of that side of things, which I think that is an issue that you illumine with great insight. At some point, I'd like to try to write something that fully integrates these two aspects. Okay, so that's all I wanted to add. I didn't mean to ramble there, but yeah, what are your
No,
thoughts?
that's helpful. Yeah, it's something I struggle with in general. Is just how do you tell this story?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
some people have said to me, well, there are too many characters, or this is not a book where there's one or two characters who you follow through. It is a book about Elon Musk, and he's on the cover, but it's also about really I call it kind of a group biography of these a couple dozen guys whose names unfortunately we all know, and maybe a couple who some readers might not know. And I admit I think sometimes there are things that get left out or weighted more than others, and the ideologies are important, and maybe something that I need to spend more time with. I think effective altruism was something that I looked at more when I was writing about crypto and Sam
Yeah.
Bankman-Fried, of course.
100%.
I think one uniting feature I do see among TESCREAL and the ideological side you're talking about is they spur their imaginations, of course, and sometimes give them goals to ostensibly aspire to, but especially utopian ones or ones about immortality. But a lot of it also seems to me to kind of construct a permission system for them. And maybe the more detailed, the better, for their purposes, whether it's about getting to Mars or surpassing the limits of the corporeal form with transhumanism. But this gives them kind of the permission to, well, for Musk, it's very clear. He has said that he needed to be a trillionaire so that he could take people to Mars. I mean, it doesn't seem like he plans to do that now, but we might have to settle for the moon.
Epstein's
whatever.
Island. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think he's going anywhere, but
No.
but it becomes the excuse or sort of the animating principle. And I think in the more sophisticated versions, with these more developed ideologies that you're talking about, there is more of kind of a world building and a narrative to wrap their dreams around there and to try to sell to people and to have conferences about or to raise money around. And given given what we've been talking about here, how these people think, the limited kind of critiques that penetrate their personal spheres, I do think those ideologies can be very powerful, especially when they become wedded to them, because, who is going to sort of be the dissenting voice or break them away from that? So, this is me kind of granting to that and maybe critiquing myself a little bit, but also, I think sometimes what I find trouble with is like, where do I place emphasis as a journalist? Or, I think when I was writing about crypto in particular, it was easier to pick out effective altruism or maybe one or two of those belief systems. And now, because it is more of a stew,
Mhm.
or it might vary from kind of billionaire to billionaire, it can be hard to figure out, okay, what should we be talking about? Or should we be talking about the TestGrail bundle, like as you have done?
So I have a few thoughts. It seems to me that there are. I mean, you mentioned the complexity of telling the story. I'm in the early stages of writing another book, and there are so many people and so many variations of these ideologies that are important to highlight. But there's an inverse relation between the precision of the text and the readability of the text. And so it's really difficult to figure out how to tell the story. So I say that to preface my follow remarks. I think there are two broad, or one could distinguish between two broad categories of people: um, the true believers, the people who aren't basically exploiting these ideologies as a superficially plausible moral excuse, or license or justification for what they wanted to do anyways. I think, I mean, I would argue at least that the founders of many of the leading AI companies that are explicitly trying to build super intelligent machines are true believers. Like Shane Legg, he was involved in the transhumanist extropian movement going back, I mean, decades. Um, Dario Amodei would be another example, hardcore EA long termist, even though he says he's not at EA anymore, which is just complete nonsense. But then I think you're right that there are other figures out there, like probably Musk, who stumbled. He apparently had some familiarity with Nick Bostrom going back many years, right? He had been talking about the simulation hypothesis, which is an idea that was really popularized by Nick Bostrom, as well as he's used the term existential risk and so on. That was coined by Nick Bostrom. Um, but it seems quite possible that he came across the long-termist ideology and thought, like, this is telling me that I am not only morally excused from caring about the global poor, et cetera, but I'm actually a morally better person for focusing on
Mm.
space colonization, making humans multiplanetary, trying to merge our brains with AI through Neuralink technologies, building superintelligence with XAI, and so on. So, like, then he thought, okay, I'm going to embrace this ideology because it makes me look good, you know. And it essentially, I mean, even more than that, it says that because a key aspect of the long-termist ideology is that we ought to re-engineer ourselves to become post-human and then spread out and colonize as much of our future light cone, the region of the universe that's theoretically accessible to us, as we possibly can to build this sprawling multi-galactic civilization. He understands that, like, from this perspective, this normative perspective, there could be people, trillions and trillions of people, billions of years in the future, who crack open their textbook on their cosmic origins, and the first paragraph is going to reference him, right? Because he's the guy who got us, enabled us to create superintelligence, which enabled us to go out and colonize space. He's, arguably one of the most important people. So what I'm saying is that long-termism also feeds his like messianic, megalomaniacal sense of
Yeah.
self-importance. And so
Yes.
from the last thing I would say is I've had conversations with a few people who have asked me this very question. Do you think that Musk really believes? Is he a true believer in long-termism and the other ideologies? I don't know. I don't think that's relevant though for me as a critic, because either way, the ideology is doing damage. Whether or not it's
Right.
actually motivating people to get into AI in the first place, which I think is the case with Shane Legg, probably Demis Hassabis, Dario Amodei, Sam Altman, and so on, or whether it's just being exploited to justify harmful actions. It doesn't matter. But
Mm.
anyways, does that make sense? Those sort of two categories.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And not to change the subject, but it also I think speaks to something that I get asked sometimes, like, are these guys really fascists, or do they really believe this
Yeah.
stuff? And you know, I do sometimes distinguish. Like, I think someone like Mark Zuckerberg is more of an opportunist, but who goes where the political winds are blowing. But some of them, yes, I think so. But in the end, it doesn't really matter because they are still acting out, this fascist view of the world and allying with fascists and, supporting those in their orbit who are explicitly fascist. So, that makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah.
I am curious about another thing that you didn't write in the book. I just want to know your opinion because I think it'd be really interesting. I'm curious about how you see the liberal holdouts in the tech industry, who you think that they are and what you think that they're up to. One person who comes to mind you mentioned earlier is Dustin Moskowitz, is at least pretending to be liberal. Like I've seen him on Blue Sky, criticizing the rightward turn of his industries, donating a ton of money to the Democratic Party. I think mostly through Future Forward PACs. There's also Reid Hoffman, who it's like, he's in the Epstein
Another friend
files,
of Epstein.
but he was a big Kamala donor. I think who are the people that didn't turn? And do you think that their politics are actually meaningfully better in any way, or are they just playing a different game?
That's a good question. Yeah, I tend to be skeptical. I mean, playing a different game might be the way to put it. I mean, that's why I think of someone like Reid Hoffman, who, I mean, in general, I think we probably all agree that there aren't any good liberal billionaires. It's sort of it's a contradiction in terms, but Reid Hoffman has funded some shady political operations, including one that spread misinformation around the Alabama Senate campaign a few years ago, I think, and he seems like one of those guys who's like, oh, I regret hanging out with Epstein a dozen times. So
he went to the island as well, as I understand.
I believe he did, yeah. And so, I think we have to broadly, as an industry and as a sector of society, be skeptical of all these people. I think someone like Moskowitz, maybe less immediately seem less threatening, certainly, and maybe there's common cause to be made with some of these folks, or we have to acknowledge that at least there's going to be a lot of money in politics until something dramatic changes, and perhaps some of these tech elites can channel their money towards ostensibly more productive uses. But even a lot of this is also about getting the Democratic Party to see tech largely as more of an adversary, and not to think that Musk or anyone else is going to come back to their side or really can be tamed. And that's a worry I have about the Democratic Party in general, or sort of like the establishment, the Newsom and Harris types that, or whoever might emerge in 2028, is that they, I saw this with crypto before. They didn't see crypto as an industry that was opposed to them, opposed to their policy priorities, and whose products hurt their consumers. I mean, hurt their constituents. That's what crypto was politically. And now, yes, big tech has a huge role to play in society. Some of its products are quite helpful to us, but politically, this is an industry that you need to be careful about, that should be considered largely adversarial to the interests of the Democrats. But I just worry that I don't know, I wonder which comes first, but I think there has to be kind of a united front among leading Democrats in how they treat the tech industry and how they treat these tech elites. Calling them the Epstein class might be a good start, and seeing them as opposed to their interests, and that it could be good. I think it probably could be good politics and the basis of a genuine populist movement, of the Sanders AOC type, to see these people for what they are, which is, corrupt plutocrats who may make us shiny toys, but also are undermining some of the very foundations of our society. So, as for where that leaves some of these less malign tech actors, maybe they can be partners in that kind of shoring up of democratic institutions, and maybe that does involve Moskowitz and other ones, funding some civic-minded philanthropy and giving money to the Democrats. But, I think that push will have to come both from the Democratic Party and from grassroots, from people saying, we're no longer happy with Democrats unless you are, speaking this populist line, and going to a wine bar with some tech elites for a fundraiser no longer cuts it.
Yeah. There's a couple other things that you talked about in the book that I actually just hadn't read a lot about before. You talked about the influence of Saudi Arabia on X. Can you say a little bit about what that is? Because I just actually had never heard about that.
Yeah, this is sort of a big personal interest of mine, is that, Saudi Arabia, as some folks know, is a huge investor. I mean, we've seen them buy up a lot of entertainment and golf and sports interests in the U.S. in recent years. And of course, they've wanted to diversify their economy away from fossil fuels. And MBS has this Vision 2030 plan. But one thing that they've done, and if you go back maybe 10 years in the Wall Street Journal, there's some good coverage of this, where at one point they called Saudi Arabia the biggest funder of startups in this country, which I thought was very notable. And you start going through this and you realize that Saudi Arabia has its tentacles everywhere, that there's Saudi money everywhere. I mean, there was this list published by Sanibel, which is kind of the main Saudi VC firm, a few years ago, which this actually surprised the tech industry that they published this list. They put it up and then they took it down, and it listed a few dozen VC firms, American VC firms, that Sanibel and by extension the Saudi government had invested in. And it's everyone: Andreessen Horowitz, Founders Fund, all the biggies. And I've really tried to look at that more and see what does that mean. What does that mean also for the authoritarian attitudes of and authoritarian practices of Silicon Valley, that their biggest investor and kind of closest political ally in some ways is a monarchical dictatorship. Mm-hmm. And I specifically look at the history of Twitter, which Saudi Arabia was the leading investor in before Musk took it private. And as some folks know, in the early 2010s, there was a Saudi spy ring operating inside Twitter. So this means that the biggest investor in Twitter was secretly coercing and paying Saudi employees to spy for them. Or actually, excuse me, Middle Eastern employees who had, one of them was Saudi, one was Lebanese, but employees of Twitter who had access to privileged information. And they were spying for the government of Saudi Arabia. We know at least 2 people were. One ended up fleeing to Saudi Arabia. One was arrested and imprisoned for a few years. I tell this story in the book. And it's been reported on a bit in Wired and The Guardian. And what essentially happened here was there were these anonymous Twitter accounts and other accounts that Saudi Arabia didn't like, the government didn't like, that were lampooning the government or criticizing them. And thanks to these employees inside Twitter, they were able to unmask these accounts, to get their IP addresses, phone numbers, things like that. And people went to jail and people were murdered by the Saudi government for this. There are people still in prison who did nothing wrong, certainly from an American free speech perspective. And, and what's very important, I think, is that Saudi Arabia is the biggest Middle Eastern market, one of the biggest overseas markets for Twitter turned X. And my critique, one of them, is that, well, Twitter had very poor internal security, but also when you bring this sort of free speech product, when you call yourself the free speech wing of the free speech party, or whatever the old Twitter slogan was, you are imperiling the people who in these authoritarian countries who you invite to use your product. I mean, and this is, I think, one of the more undersung aspects of sort of the damage that Twitter and Facebook have done overseas, is that we've heard about their role in kind of political violence and oppression in some places like the Philippines or elsewhere. But you had these companies like Twitter and other social networks going into these countries that don't have free speech, or where they're like places like India, where they forced Twitter to have an Indian agent employed on their behalf, or in China. If you ever heard about the security researcher named Mudge, he just goes by that one name. He testified to some of this before Congress, that there was a Chinese spy on the Twitter payroll, and some of this stuff happens kind of willingly because, hey, if the price of getting into Turkey or Pakistan or one of these other illiberal democracies is, and getting access to 20 million more customers is, you have to censor some stuff or hire a spy, so be it. But what happens in practice, and the Twitter story shows this, is that people lose their lives or their freedom. And this is something that was a big deal for Twitter, but they've suppressed it a lot, and they've been sued about all this. And then once Musk took over the company, what really happened was the Saudi role just went kind of subterranean, because now it's a privately held company. And this is something also I write about in the book, was participating in a lawsuit, or intervening really in a lawsuit, filing a motion to get the investor list of X before it merged with XAI, to get that disclosed. And what we saw was a lot of Middle Eastern sovereign wealth fund money from Qatar and the UAE, also monarchies that are dictatorships. And this is kind of the longer story of Saudi Arabia and these Middle Eastern dictatorships in Silicon Valley. But I think it's deeply important. I think it's both for the money and also how the Silicon Valley culture and even style of governance has developed. And this is something also that Ben Horowitz from Andreessen Horowitz has talked about. there's this line I quote in the book where he's talking to a Saudi counterpart, and he says, we talk about founders in Silicon Valley. You also have a founder, except you call him Your Highness. Like, these are people who style themselves as kings, practically, the Silicon Valley elites. And they found a lot in common with their principal investor, which is Saudi Arabia.
That's fascinating. I had no idea. So you think it's incumbent upon the social media companies to restrict certain kinds of speech from people who are
Not
living
necess-
within the authoritarian regimes?
I don't think necessarily to restrict speech, but to understand that they play a very sensitive role. Like, in the case of Twitter, a lot of this stuff could have been prevented by simply having more security procedures around internally, around how consumer data is
I see.
collected,
Yeah.
around what internal controls you have for employees to have access to. So, those anonymous Twitter accounts in Saudi Arabia could have gone on doing their thing and criticizing the government if Twitter's internal controls were better.
Yeah.
And so, I don't want these companies to restrict speech, but I do want them to think and act more deliberately when they move into these countries where their services are potentially putting people in peril or inviting them to break the law locally, essentially.
Last time we had you on the show, we talked a lot about Joe Lonsdale and the Cicero Institute and the sort of terrible plans that these tech billionaires have for the way that they want to treat homeless people. David Sachs was a big figure there that you mentioned, and his radicalization in San Francisco, and also the people that join him on that podcast. You even mentioned Gavin Newsom, but there's been some developments there since the last time we had you on the show. I think I saw that in Utah they even have plans to just basically literally round up all the homeless people, and this is coming from Cicero Institute policy. Like, what are the developments that you've seen over the past year or so with the Cicero Institute and that particular that particular policy area?
Well, I think you're getting at the other side of these guys not wanting to be governed, which is that when they have to be governed, they want total control over the political institutions and to move them their direction. I mean, I think this is something. There's an old clip of Peter Thiel essentially talking about this. And, in Austin, I talk about the Cicero Institute, Joe Lonsdale's kind of think tank that has had a lot of success, unfortunately, especially in helping define anti-homeless laws around the country. And there are places now where it's illegal to sleep outside with a sheet of cardboard on you or to cover yourself with anything, not much less camp in public. And I think what's very alarming is how they've already criminalized homelessness, but the really and they're obviously unbothered by ICE raids pretty much, but the kind of extremely draconian, even kind of savage approach to basic law and order, especially because these people come from a group of kind of white-collar lawbreakers, but Joe Lonsdale has talked about bringing back public hangings, and he retweets these accounts. They're these Austin accounts. I mean, frankly, I wonder if they have any connection to the Cicero Institute, but I don't know if they do. But there are these billboards that have gone up in Austin. Some people have sent me pictures of them, and then there's these similar Twitter accounts. I don't have the names offhand, but that are basically like Save Austin or something like that. That are perpetuating this idea that Austin, like a lot of other liberal large cities, is this dangerous hellhole. And this is what we saw in San Francisco with David Sachs and others, which I write about and have talked about. This idea that urban areas and blue cities especially are kind of irredeemable, and that the only thing that's left to do is to send in the troops. And this is also something we heard from Mark Benioff even a few months back, and then he sort of apologized, but still is making ICE jokes and doesn't even really live in San Francisco anymore. But there's just such a kind of misanthropic disgust towards other people, and that feeds into some very anachronistic ideas about law and order. I mean, I think it's not even I think it is of a piece with all this that now we hear Lonsdale talking about hunting down communists. It's almost like we've gone back a century or two. And I don't exactly know what legislative priorities the Cicero Institute is getting at now, but it's basically in line with the Trump agenda of extreme carceral solutions to anything affecting kind of the poor or the masses of people, and a free-for-all for everyone at the top. And with a real as they might say, a bias towards violence.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's what's really troubling. Like, no one from the supposedly freedom-loving sector of tech or liberty-minded community seems to be bothered so far by the horrific violence and lawlessness of ICE. And so I think as their own meal ticket increasingly comes from the state or doing work for ICE and related organizations, they're only going to kind of continuing to support that on the legislative and policy level, which is what I expect to come out of people like Lonsdale and the Cicero Institute.
It's awful. Yes, go ahead. Sorry.
I've got one last question before we bring this to a close. So there are some commentators who talk who claim that there used to be a good internet, right? And the good internet then was ruined by money and advertising, et cetera. Do you think that's the case?
Yeah, I like that question because I've seen some people write pretty interestingly about that, or even about Cory Doctorow's and shitification idea. I think Jacob Backrack wrote a piece for the New Republic that I liked about that. I thought about writing about this at one point, that I am a little skeptical. Not a little. I'm skeptical of kind of the nostalgic, rose-tinted glasses view of the internet. Yeah, there was a good internet for some people, I suppose. And some of us, especially early adopters or people kind of older millennials and above, probably have some very fond memories of playing games in the 90s, or the dial-up world, or BBS systems, or wherever it might be, or early role-playing games, all these kinds of things. But the early internet or the idealized internet is a very specific vision that was available to a limited number of people, of course. And there are ways in which the explosion of access to the internet and the provisions of new services are things that I think we'd want to keep in any kind of drastic reforming of the internet we have now. But yeah, I think the idea that there is a previous internet or a prelapsarian vision of the internet before the fall that we need to go back to is not really a helpful or correct one, and not an achievable one, certainly. So that is one that doesn't really work for me, I guess, as an analytical view, because I also wonder, like, well, what are you trying to go back to? Yes, we may have all kind of instinctually felt better about that older internet, but it is a much different technological, economic, social, and cultural place with many fewer people accessing it than what we have now. So, I'm curious about kind of fundamentally different and positive articulations of what we could achieve going forward, or what we should aspire towards. But to me, it's not about going back to the Oregon Trail and message boards.
I loved the Oregon Trail.
As much as I like those things.
Speaking of the internet getting worse or better, have you followed the conversation about, I think it's Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, and how that apparently is under threat? And the claim is that this little known section of this piece of legislation has enabled the internet to be what it is today, and without it, everything would just collapse. It would be impossible to leave a Yelp review without Yelp being sued out of business, whatever. So, do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, I am not. I have to admit, I'm a bit of a fence sitter, maybe because in some ways, like, I don't know, I talk to people who seem very certain of the kind of view you're just talking about, that, if we remove Section 230, everything collapses in a bad way.
Yeah.
And there are some people who seem to think, especially lately, or like the actor Joseph Gordon-Levitt, I think, was on Capitol Hill, that if you pull Section 230 out of the Jenga tower, actually a lot of good reforms could happen from that. I'm probably more sympathetic to reforming it or removing it in some way, because I do want to see the powers of the tech companies brought to heel in some way. But I also think, a lot of that clearly is economic, and, even on the level of taxation would certainly be an important way to reel in their power. I don't think Section 230 is kind of the great originating event of the modern internet. I think it's important. I don't think it's necessarily the original sin or the original catalyst for all the growth we've had. And I think perhaps just so we can move beyond it, we need to get rid of it
Yeah.
and find new ways of governing the internet, new laws and new regulatory mechanisms that don't put so much kind of weight on just this one section of the Telecommunications Act from the mid-90s. So, I am curious to hear, actually, if you have a specific opinion of why we do need to remove it, because I would say lately I have not been on the cutting edge of all the arguments. But mostly I do remain skeptical of those who say, if you remove it, everything collapses in this way we can't rebuild from.
Yeah. I don't have any strong opinion, mostly because I'm just not sufficiently informed about it. So I wouldn't describe myself as a fence sitter or as pro or against, But
Sure.
and just for listeners who are a bit curious, like my understanding is that this section 230 is, as I mentioned before, like you can leave a Yelp review without Yelp being sued. So if you say something defamatory, then you are held liable for that that misdeed rather than the platform. So it's what enables like the platforms that provide a voice, a means of communication with everyone else on the internet to survive, right? Without just being sued into oblivion, because on every platform, every website, there's going to be somebody who's going to say something defamatory. So, Twitter, et cetera, they're not held accountable for false and reputationally harmful claims. You are, right? And so without Section 230, then suddenly that opens up the floodgates for all of these websites and platforms to be sued, and suddenly it just becomes untenable for them to persist. But again, like,
which might be cool, if it were untenable for them to persist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also, I am not a lawyer, but you can imagine, if Section 230 went away, say someone sues Facebook because someone, said something libelous on there about them, and maybe a federal judge decides, basically, in their interpretation of other existing law, libel law doesn't apply to the platforms, but it might apply to the speaker of the libel.
Yeah.
Like, I could, again, I'm not a legal expert, but one could imagine that playing out in some ways because it sort of describes the publishing environment we have now.
Yeah.
And we haven't even talked about like antitrust or Lena Khan or any of those things.
Yeah.
Like, I am interested in Section 230 being less of this sort of shibboleth. But I also think, if we're talking about chipping away at tech power or holding these companies accountable, we have to be talking about antitrust and taxation and using more levers of the law. So I think we as important as 230 is, maybe it is sometimes overvalued by one side or another.
Interesting.
Moving my cat here, you might see him on screen.
We love cats. This is an extremely pro-cat show. It's one of the defining factors of the ideology we're promoting.
Catism.
Yes, we have had such a great time chatting with you. Listeners, I think that you will enjoy Jacob's book so much. It's called Gilded Rage, Elon Musk and the Radicalization of Silicon Valley. One thing that's really cool is that you can listen to it in audiobook format, and Jacob's actually reading it. So that's probably how I'll check out the sections that I plan on going back to. I really think that if you're a fan of the show, you will be a fan of the book. So thank you so much for coming on the show, Jacob.
Thank you, and I appreciate what you two do. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.